wonder what heaven will be like? I do. I spend a lot of time thinking about that. As Christians, we talk a lot about the hope of heaven without exactly saying what it is. And what I've noticed is that in some places, some churches, it's easier to talk about hell than it is to talk about heaven. And I'm wondering if that's because we have more experience with hell on earth than we do with heaven on earth. Especially those of us who were there, who remember the attacks of September 11th. And I feel for those of you who are younger, who have grown up knowing only war. There was a time before that time. And it used to be around Halloween, you would find some churches offering something that was called Judgment House, which was sort of a Christian version of a house of terrors designed to frighten you into salvation. I kind of scratched my head over that. I wish that was the way to bring people in, really to scare them straight. It doesn't seem to work. When I read about Jesus in the Bible, I do not see people coming to him because they were scared of hell or scared of Jesus. I see people coming to Jesus because they found the love of God in him and they found healing for life's wounds. In Jesus, outsiders became insiders. And sinners were not afraid to come to Jesus with the messiness of their lives, because here they knew there was someone who would understand, who would accept them, forgive them, and clean them up without sicking Freddy Krueger on them. Do y'all know who Freddy Krueger is? Okay. Thank you. I'm worried about you now. Okay, yes, the Bible does speak of judgment, but the one who judges us is not like Pennywise the clown. Do you know who Pennywise is?
Unfortunately.
You have not read or seen it. I am very disappointed in this congregation today. It is not like the ghost from Scream. Anybody know Scream? Do I just have to sit here and keep naming horror movies until you all come up with one you know? Frankenstein. Okay. This is not God. This is not Jesus. Jesus is the one who loves us and created us and loved us into the image of God. And that kind of changes things. Y'all, we know a lot about hell. I do not think we know enough about heaven. Most of the images of heaven do not inspire delight as much as they inspire boredom. And as I shared with the congregation who was gathered here yesterday for Oliver Owen's funeral, heaven is not sitting around on a cloud. That's kind of boring. There used to be a Far Side cartoon of a guy on a cloud saying, "I wish I bought a book." You know? That's not heaven. Heaven is to be constantly in praise and worship. And if that sounds boring to you, I want you to imagine the finest celebration of worship you have ever experienced. When you were just lifted up to another place. That's something like heaven. And I know that sometimes services can seem more hellish than heavenly, but think on those experiences. Now the Sadducees have come to Jesus with a question about heaven, and actually it was a trick question. They say a woman has died and she had 7 husbands, so at the resurrection, whose wife will she be? Now there are those who cannot imagine death ending their marriage, despite the fact that the marriage vows are only good until death do us part. Then there are others who absolutely shudder to think that their marriage relationship will continue out of death. I heard a story which sounds true, maybe it's not, but it sounds true. Some friends were trying to comfort a woman whose husband died with a solace that they would be together again. And the widow turned to the preacher and said, "I'm never going to get away from him, am I?" One theologian has said, if the world to come is just a continuation of this one, then the prospect of eternal life is not something everyone looks forward to. No wonder we know more about hell than we do about heaven. Y'all, the world to come is not a continuation of this life. It's as different as night from day. And I think more than theologians, poets and those who write children's stories do it best. And there's been kind of a grace about the past couple of days and past couple of weeks, because in the Rector's Forum we've touched on this and talked about heaven. And then I've had the privilege of sitting with families and planning for funerals. And what I'm about to share, I've shared with them. C.S. Lewis closes the Chronicles of Narnia, which is one of my favorite children's stories, with these words spoken by the Christly lion, King Aslan. He says, "All of you, as you used to call it in the Shadowlands, are dead. The term is over. The holidays have begun. The dream is ended. This is the morning." And as he spoke, he no longer looked to them like a lion, but the things that began to happen after that were so great and beautiful that I cannot write about them. And for us, this is the end of all stories. And we can most truly say that they all lived happily ever after. But for them, it was only the beginning of the real story. All their life in this world and all their adventures in Narnia had only been the cover and the title page. Now at last, they were beginning chapter 1 of the great story, which no one on earth has read, which goes on forever, in which every chapter is better than before. And for those of us who love books, I take great solace in that. Because you know how it feels when you put down a great book, and maybe tears come up, not just because of how the story ended, but the fact that the story ended. Our story in Jesus Christ never comes to an end. That's heaven. And it's not just the surroundings that get changed. Beloved, we are changed as well. St. Paul said, "Listen, I will tell you a mystery. We will all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised imperishable, and we will all be changed." All of us will be changed. That's good news. We're changed at death into the fuller likeness of God, which means I sit at the heavenly banquet table with those who hurt me, as well as those I have hurt, because God's grace is different now. I'm not just sitting with the beloved. I'm sitting with those that I consider less than loved, but we're all together because we have all been changed. We're changed. We're still recognizable as whatever it is that makes us unique, but we are more ourselves as God intended us to be. I pray that begins to sound like a place you want to be. And my experience with heaven has been with the privilege of being with people in those final moments of life when I see that change from the eternal, from this body, from the finite to the eternal. When I was with Oliver Owens on Wednesday morning, there was such a presence with us. And for a moment it was just Oliver and Carolyn and myself. And then the room began to get very crowded. And I felt his father with him, right here. His dad has been gone for a long time. And then I felt all the saints and the company of heaven come in. And then his son came in. And Oliver died about 60 seconds after that. We're changed. The people we love are changed. This earth changes for us, and we experience heaven. And because I love children's stories, and because I think they tell the greatest truth, I want to share the end of one of my favorite stories, and I just shared it recently in the Rector's Forum. It's Oscar Wilde's The Selfish Giant. I highly recommend, if you do not know this book, to get a copy. And surprisingly enough, it's a very little book. It tells the story of a selfish giant. And the selfish giant was one who had a beautiful garden. And all the children in the village loved to come and play in the garden. And the giant felt like the kids were messing up his garden. And don't you understand how that feels, especially you as parents? Have you ever cleaned the house and just cleaned the floors, and in come the kids, and in come the dogs, and there are muddy footprints all over the place, and that perfect place has been messed up? That's how the giant was feeling about his garden. Some of you are looking at your parents as I share this thing. That's us. So what the giant decided to do was to build a wall, a great big wall around his garden, so it was protected, and the children couldn't come in, and he could enjoy that garden just for himself. And he did. But then one day he was sitting down, and he looked out, and there was a little boy who had somehow broken into the garden. And when the child broke into the garden, he broke into the giant's heart. And he became the giant's first friend. The child had found a chink in the wall and had come in through that chink. And of course, other children followed, and the chink, the bricks in the giant's heart melted. And he begins then to destroy the wall so that the children can come back in and play. But he never again sees that first friend, the little boy who melted his heart, until this time. It says every afternoon when school was over, the children came and played with the giant. The little boy whom the giant loved was never seen again. The giant was very kind with all the children, yet he longed for his first little friend and often spoke of him. "How I would like to see him," he said. Years went over, and the giant grew very old and feeble. He could not play about anymore, so he sat in a huge armchair and watched the children at their games and admired his garden. "I have many beautiful flowers," he said, "but the children are the most beautiful flowers of all." One winter morning, he looked out of his window as he was dressing. He did not hate winter now, for he knew that it was merely the spring asleep and the flowers were resting. Suddenly, he rubbed his eyes in wonder and looked and looked. It was certainly a marvelous sight. In the farthest corner of the garden was a tree quite covered with lovely white blossoms. Its branches were golden, and silver fruit hung down from them, and underneath it stood the little boy whom he loved. Downstairs ran the giant in great joy and out into the garden. He hastened across the grass and came near to the child. And when he came quite close, his face grew red with anger, and he said, "Who hath dared to wound thee?" For on the palms of the child's hand were the prints of 2 nails, and the prints of 2 nails were on the little feet. "Who hath dared to wound thee?" cried the giant. "Tell me, that I may take my big sword and slay him." "Nay," answered the child, "but these are the wounds of love." "Who art thou?" said the giant, and a strange awe fell on him, and he knelt before the little child. And the child smiled on the giant and said to him, "You let me play once in your garden. Today you shall come with me to my garden, which is paradise." Amen.
Amen.